Well, what a great setup we have here. The venue, the evening, and couldn't have been any better, so I hope that presentation deserves the atmosphere. Just a little background to RUM Jungle. People say RUM Jungle, what's this phosphate and potash doing coming out of the centre of Australia? And Aboriginals will be more confused when they see these trains going up the line one day in my dreams with RUM Jungle on the side, wondering where the jungle is. But the company floated in 78 and we had a lot of uranium assets, and I picked the name because we had a lot of projects in the old RUM Jungle area, which was Australia's first uranium mine. But apart from that, everybody tells me they love the name, so we've kept it. All we did was change the name from RUM Jungle Uranium to RUM Jungle Resources as we changed our attention to the discoveries of phosphate and then potash. Basically, a little bit about the company. There's four directors. Rob Annals is the chairman. I'm the managing director. We have a non-executive director, Jeff Landels, who was the head of the Incitec Pivot operations when Western Mining sold them to BHP, and he helped in that process. And I have another director who's an executive, Chris Ziolis, a younger man than me, but he's out of McKinsey and Rio, and he's very good at handling these pre-feasibility studies that we're now doing with Willie Parsons and big Chinese group. So we feel that we can handle the immediate future. Our intent is to find, develop, operate phosphate and potash fertiliser mineral projects. We are the only Australian company with both a JORC resource of phosphate and potash. We first discovered the phosphate and it was much bigger than we far imagined. I'm going to have to go through this presentation a little out of synchronisation with what you're seeing on the slide, because there's 60 slides and I'm going to jump a lot of them and give you the keen spots without going through all the literature. I know you'll like the photos better. So the only company that has both those commodities with JORC resources. We have a market cap of 42 million. 381 million shares, current price 12 cents. One of our major attributes is our shareholders. Washington H. Soul Patterson have been behind us since we first discovered the phosphate, and they've continuously built their stake and put in more money and participated in any placement. In the last placement we raised $13.5 million in December, 10 million through a placement and 3.5 million with an SPP, and Regal Funds Management, the largest funds management group in Australia, I think, came into that with a big chunk. Farjoy are well known as a back of the Robinson family under Frank Robinson and his three sons, Alliance Selection and Acorn. So our institutional holding is 40% of the company, which says a lot for its projects. When you look at the projects, if you look at that Northern Territory map in the light blue, you can see there's a area called the Barrow Creek area, which is where all our phosphate is, and down to the left of the railway is the Coringa Lakes Potash project. So both these are in the Northern Territory, and we've recently expanded the potash plays into Western Australia on the border with major lake systems and into South Australia to Lake Torrens, which could be huge potential. So I'm going to talk about the phosphate first, and then I'll talk about the potash. In the last 12 months we completed 100% takeover of our neighbour, Central Australian Phosphate. We discovered our phosphate deposit on the border of our tenement, and it ran into the adjoining tenement opened by this public company, CEN, and eventually we decided we had to take it over because this gave us the potential to find over 1 billion tonne resource, the largest resource certainly in Australia, in one single deposit, and we're still infill drilling and building up that profile. Basically, phosphate. A lot of people can't get their head around the difference between phosphate and potash. There's only 3 ingredients for fertilisers. NPK. I know if your wife goes down and buys something for her roses, she'll buy NPK. Nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. K is potassium. This is a photo from Tennessee Valley Authority, 1942, where they did a trial with phosphate and without phosphate, and the one on the left speaks for itself. I'm going to quickly run through these. Everybody who is here probably is interested in the phosphate space if they've come to listen to me, so you know what the predictions are. In the far right is the huge population expansion expected in Asia, and this will result in falling land areas and increasing fertiliser usage. So all these graphs point to an upward trend. If I can just briefly talk about our project. On the left of that vertical line where the purple is, that tenement to the left was the RUM Jungle exploration licence where we first discovered our potash. So the purpley area with the black stibbling in the middle is just reflecting the amount of drilling. We have a measured resource in there, and the other areas to the left are indicated and inferred. To the right, Central Australian Phosphate published this map in their defence takeover saying that they had a much bigger resource than us. And we knew that in the middle of that yellowy area to the right there was a dam that was actually put in by the pastoralist that was in phosphate from the surface. So we knew very well that that was correct, and our case to our shareholders and to their shareholders was that together the resource would be much more valuable than being separated into two. We succeeded in that takeover in December with 100% acquisition. So we ended up with a resource on the left-hand side of 550 million tonnes, combining CEN and RUM Jungle. And on the right-hand side, in that, I think you call it a tetragon or something, is in the light green area, is the drilling that was just completed prior to Christmas. There's a space in the middle because even though this is pastoral company, we have to have Aboriginal clearance of sacred sites and everything we drill, as does everyone else. And they didn't have time before Christmas to clear that area in the middle, and it's a bit more bushy, so we drilled out that area on the right, and we recently published that map showing all the drill holes. So some drill holes are up 24 metres in thickness. The red areas are high grade, over 25%. Basically what that is telling you is that there's a continuous resource in there, and we're very optimistic about the size. If you look at the size of it, it matches the size on the left, which is 550 million tonnes. So in another 3 or 4 weeks we will have a JORC inferred resource of that extra area, and we still have the area in the middle to drill, which will start in April or May, and this deposit will be well over 1 billion tonnes, which puts it in a world-class scale without any doubt, and there's nothing like it in Australia. If you look at that graph, it shows some of the deposits around the world that are marked for development, and the 1/4 from the left is ours, with what we expect with the completion of that phase with the light green drilling, and we think it's going to be a lot bigger than that. So, and the red dots are the grade, so we're pretty well up there with the grade. Where you look at those higher grades, they're probably underground potential mines elsewhere in the world. If you look at this example of how close it is to the surface where we first discovered it, we can access 30% direct shipping sort of material, but inverted commas, because it would need some upgrading to be direct shipping. But it's a resource that can be easily attacked close to the surface. And we came back from China last week, where we were working with a company called China International Chemical Corporation that took us around looking at potash mines, and we were guests of some other phosphate miners interested in coming to Australia that took us to a phosphate mine. And that's a classic Chinese phosphate mine. Probably one of the more difficult ones. It's 500 metres deep, as nearly all of them are. That horizontal seam there is a bed of 30% phosphate. It's hard. It's about 1 metre wide, and someone's got to get in there and drill and blast it, and then they've got to scrape it out with that machine into the adit where it's taken away in small trucks. 90% of China's phosphate mining is underground, and most of it is deeper than 600 metres. And the only big open cut I've seen, I remember in Yunnan province, had 15 benches, and every bench had drill and blasting. So these things in the Georgina Basin, and particularly ours, are just amazing projects. That's actually that dam that I told you about in the middle of the Argonara resource, which is 15% phosphate at the surface. So all the white material is actually phosphate rock. The main resource is close to rail. As you can see there, it's 97 kilometres, and there's a railway line, there's the Stewart Highway, Bitumen Highway, and there's a gas pipeline. So infrastructure is pretty good. And when it gets to Darwin, it's got the whole of Southeast Asia, India, open for potential shipping. And we have a huge freight differential between African ore and Mediterranean ore that has to come through the sewers to get to these places. So we've got a start. We did a scoping study, and they came up with 3 options: a direct high-grade rock export, which would be heavily discounted, I believe, or there's an option to do the rock export and then beneficiate it, or then there's phosphoric acid export, which is worth $1,000 a tonne and would allow us to much more capital expenditure, but would certainly alleviate the high operating cost of rail. Just a quick look at where we're going through our timeline. We're in the pre-feasibility now. Worley Parsons are halfway through that. Should be finished by June, and we'll make a decision on which is the best way to go from there. Our tenement holdings combined with the takeover and our own tenements follow the old shoreline, and there's just enormous exploration potential still left, and we have applied for other areas in the hope that we may find some high grade right on the railway line, which would also work in with the development of the other operation. The Coringa Creek I'd like to talk about now. This is the potassium play. Potash minerals occur in subsurface brines under salt lakes. So you have to get your head around this a bit, but we've just been to China, where we saw the 2 biggest operations in China. One produces 2.3 million tonnes of potassium chloride, another produced 1.3 million tonnes of potassium sulfate. The salt lakes in Utah are major producers. What you have to remember is the potassium is already dissolved in the brine. We don't have to go a kilometre underground like they do in Saskatchewan, where BHP had tried to do a 40 billion takeover of Potash Corp, where they're talking about $1 billion development of Jansen. The potash has been dissolved out of underlying sediments. It's sitting in the brine, and we need to extract that brine, and we do it cheaply by pumping or using trenches, which you'll see in these photos. And then you build these huge evaporation ponds, which are basically like the salt lakes in Dampier. And you're using solar evaporation in the middle of Australia, which is where you find all these deposits in Utah or up in the north of China, where it's very arid and there's an evaporation rate of around 3 metres a year of evaporation. So the sun is doing the work. It's making the salt drop out of the brine where you separate the various salts, and I'll go into that a bit later. But there's one thing that's important to know. There's 2 products. There's sulfate of potash, and there's MOP, which is muriate of potash. So the Canadians produce MOP, which is the chloride, and you cannot use that in fertigation on vegetables and orchards and things like that. You must use potash as sulfate. Hence it has a $200 premium. It's worth about $600 a tonne, whereas the other's worth $400. In these salt lakes, the operating cost of producing potassium chloride is around $200 a tonne US. Where they turn it into potassium sulfate by adding sulfuric acid, the cost goes up to $400. Hence it's got a $200 premium over chloride. It's a bit hard to see this map, but it came out in November last year, produced by Geoscience Australia. And they actually entitled it Potash Potential of Australian Salt Lakes. Now, if you look at Lake Eyre, sort of in the middle there, the blue area, you all know where Lake Eyre is, you'll see there's Lake Torrens underneath it. The red indicates that it has potential to be one of the highest grade potash producers in Australia of all the lakes, and it's the second largest lake in Australia. And we were able to acquire that as a result of this map. Our area is in the middle of Australia, where we have the Lake Amadeus, Angus Downs, Coringa Lakes. You can see Lake Torrens down there. I've just expanded this. We have the southern half of Lake Mackay. We have Lake Hopkins on the border, the Coringa Lakes. So all our work to date, we've spent about $4.5 million in getting a measured resource on Coringa Lakes for the potash. We've done this by doing trenching, pumping, producing salts on site, using laboratories, and finally we've engaged the biggest Chinese operators to come down, which they did last week, and help us do a pre-feasibility or more a scoping study on the Coringa Lake's potential for producing potash. The black line going through that big lake, which is Lake Mackay, is the Northern Territory and the West Australian border. On the west side is Western Australia. So you can see Lake Amadeus out to the right of that line, which is that long skinny lake, and then where those tenements, the white tenements are, is our project. So all the brine in these lakes is very similar, and there's a theory put forward by many geoscientists and hydrogeologists that the water comes in from those mountains to the left. If you look at that scale there, it's 200 kilometres, and the water comes in through the aquifers, and then it comes up through a series of major lineaments that have got that northwest orientation and evaporates the salts out on the surface, which means that we have a replacing brine that's enriched in potassium. So as we pump it out, we believe it replaces. It's well located. You can see that in the Coringa Lakes there's a number of lakes. They extend over about 150 kilometres, and to the north of them, that red line is the Lassiter Highway, which is an excellent bitumen highway that runs to Ayers Rock from the Stewart Highway and the railway line. So it's not a stranded asset like a lot of these other lakes, and it would give us the opportunity to start something small and build up and perhaps get a cash flow even quicker than the phosphate. There's just a little cartoon there. This is on our website, but there's a philosophy there in that right top cartoon, how the brine forms, and there's a picture of all the lakes and Lake Amadeus, and the Australian Geoscience have presented this flow of groundwater coming into what they call the Central Australian Groundwater Discharge Zone. So there's a lot of science in believing that we have a unique system here. The picture on the left just shows some pump testing and drilling on the lakes to produce enough brine. To really test this, we put 100-metre trenches out into the lake, and they immediately fill with brine. And what we do is we pump those for 30 days, and we put these measuring instruments out all over the lake to measure if there's a drop in the brine under the lake surface. And it allows us to really get confidence whether or not this is replacing itself. Once we maintain a constant pumping rate without losing the brine, after 30 days we then turn it off. We measure the quality of the water. It doesn't lose any salinity. It keeps its potassium and its sulphate. And then we watch the recharge as soon as we turn the pumps off, and it comes straight back up again. We pump those out into dry lakes. We did 4 of these trench tests out of these various ponds, and then we did a trial salt production on site. So each of these 3 tanks, this was a winter trial, we did 3,000 litre tanks. Now the quantity of salt in these tanks is 25%. So you can imagine that when there's 3,000 litres of materials evaporated, it will produce 800 kilos of salt, and basically that's how it ends up looking. When we see the potassium stops rising in that remaining brine, it's all sodium chloride that's fallen out at this stage. This is the beauty of the operation. The sun does the work for you. So the first thing that naturally falls out through fractional crystallisation is sodium chloride, common salt. The potassium rises from 0.5% to 5%, and then we extract that rich potassium brine and put it in those yellow tanks where the sun precipitates a mixture of potassium and sodium and magnesium salts. And that's basically the measurements every week as we took them, showing the potassium going up in the brine. And that area is where we were recommended to remove the brine to produce a viable potassium salt mixture for flotation separation. We actually produced the salts in MW Waters laboratories here in Sydney. These are examples of some of the major operations around the world. The one on the left was Chinese operation. The one on the bottom left, using these evaporation tanks, is Atacama Desert in Chile, showing that they've used plastic liners to line the dams. You can either use clay or plastic. The one on the right, top right, is Salt Lake City, and the bottom right again is a channel in China. So we were invited up there by CICC to look at these two major operations, Lake Kahan in Qinghai province and Luobopo. So these are very remote areas where at our banquets each night we were reminded that we're eating wolf. That's how bad it is. And we're on the border with Mongolia and all these mountains. And wolf and carp, I hope we'll be seeing more than that tonight. But that was quite an experience. So we arrived there about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, and we gave a presentation on rum jungle to the Qinghai people, and then they took us out to their project. Basically, this is the largest producer in China, one of the largest in the world. That lake is something like 150 kilometres long. The water in it is just fresh water that comes out of those rivers from the mountains to the south. This is a very arid, cold climate. There's ice everywhere when we were there. The far left of that lake is where this company produces its potash from. It was about 8,000 parts per million potassium, which is only 0.8%. And you can see that black line where that foresty looking material is running out to all those lakes on the right hand side. That's a 60 kilometre pipeline which is 4 metres diameter that extracts all the brine out of those trenches and boreholes and pumps it 60 kilometres into those evaporation ponds. Just a close-up of the evaporation ponds. Now this operation's been going 50 years, and that is their plant. Now this is the biggest economic provider in the whole of Qinghai province. Now the potash part of it is the part up on the left where you can see sort of a bright green dash, but it's a very small part of the operation. They make something out of every element that's in that brine. They make magnesium metal, 100,000 tonnes a year. They make PVC plastics, polyvinyl chloride out of the magnesium chloride. And they make the materials for glass out of the sodium compounds. So it's an incredible place. That's just the small potash plant there that you're looking at on a model. So they have those big dams, which are the final evaporation ponds, like those little yellow tanks I showed you. And those vessels out on the ponds are actually dredges. So they don't mine it hard, they save their costs. They pump the slurry out of the bottom of those final tanks and it goes into that plant, where on the left you'll see thickeners, and then it goes into a drying area where they dry the salts out, and then they're redissolved, and they, in the far hand right side, they go through different stages of temperature where they employ no chemical but just temperature, and that's called fractional crystallisation. So all the various compounds separate very cheaply, and that produces 2.3 million tonnes of potassium chloride. That's a typical dredge. Every one of those ponds has got one of these dredges. You can see the salt. I'm standing on the edge of the lake where I took that photo, and that's how it's done. At the Luobopo potassium sulfate operation, it's the same thing. They've got a coal-fired power station in the foreground, and it goes through the thickeners into the separation tanks and crystallisers. And what you're looking at out the back is the first stage settlement where all the sodium chloride drops out, and those long narrow places are where they have the final crystallisation for pumping into the plant with the dredges. This is just a photo of the process engineers and everyone that came out. 12 of them have been on site all last week on one of our lakes at Coringa. And I mean, learning from these guys is like learning from people that really know the business. You've got to take your hat off to Chinese technology. We've just found it incredible. I had to show you that while we were in Xi'an. We had 6 hours, so we took a taxi out to see the clay warriors. So if you're ever in China, you want to go and see that because it's just amazing. There's 7,000 warriors. I only found them about 20 years ago. So in conclusion, we have a large JORC phosphate resource. We have diversified with both phosphate and potash, close to infrastructure and markets. We've achieved milestones over 3 years that I think have been amazing, and we're certainly well supported by the institutional community, and this is certainly a long-term project. Thank you.